Ukrainian Armed Forces advanced in the northern and northeastern parts of Kondratovka. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War described the situation in the Sumy region. Thus, Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashovets reported that Ukrainian forces advanced between Kondratovka and Konstantinovka east of Alekseyevka and entered Novonikolaevka. Russian war correspondents claim that on July the 8th, the Ukrainian armed forces entered Kondratovka from the northwest and Alekseyevka from the northeast. One of the Z publics claims that Ukrainian forces are already in the northern and central parts of Kondratovka. Thus, it was possible to cut off Putin's army from the ground supply line along the S-191502 Novonikolayevka-Vladimirovka highway. To support the withdrawal of its troops from Kondratovka, the Kremlin has transferred units of the 40th Marine Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces to the section of the front. The occupiers from the 155th Marine Brigade, who are trying to maintain control of positions south of Alekseyevka, are also in a difficult situation. Analysts write that the offensive of the Russian armed forces in the Sumy region slowed down in late May and early June. Since mid-June, the Ukrainian armed forces have begun counterattacks, reclaiming territory after territory. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, stated that the fighting in the Slobozhansky direction remains intense. Ukrainian forces are not only holding their positions, but are also fighting in the Kursk region and in the Belgorod region. It was in May and June that the Russian Ministry of Defense decided to transfer its elite units of unmanned systems from Kursk and Sumy regions to Donbass. However, Russia may also reinforce its forward units in the north of Sumy Oblast in the near future to continue its advance towards the city of Sumy. Ukrainian forces have halted Russia's recent advance into the northeastern Sumy region and stabilized the front line near the Russian border. Recently, Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief, General Oleksandr Syrsky, stated that a successful defense in the Sumy region has prevented Russia from redeploying around 50,000 troops, including elite, airborne and marine brigades, to other parts of the front line. Based on the results of May and June, we can say that this year's wave of the enemy's summer offensive from Russian territory is faltering. Syrsky said. Syrsky said a special defense group has been formed to improve security and defense in Sumy and surrounding communities. Its focus is improving fortifications and accelerating the construction of additional defensive barriers.
Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, reported the restoration of Ukrainian troops' positions and the holding of territories in the Kursk and Belgorod regions of Russia. This marked an important step in the context of the current frontline situation. At the meeting of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's headquarters, attention was focused on the most active directions, namely Pokrovsk, Lyman, Novopavlivka, and northern Slobozhansky. Over the past day, there were 188 combat engagements, resulting in Russian troop losses exceeding 1,000 personnel. Syrsky emphasized that Ukrainian forces are actively defending their positions, particularly in the Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka directions, preventing the Russian army from advancing deeper into the territory, as well as trying to stop the enemy from reaching the administrative borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. The commander-in-chief highlighted the importance of holding positions in the border Kursk and Belgorod regions, noting that Ukrainian forces continue to control the situation, not giving Russian troops any respite. The staff meeting also addressed strengthening and improving the unmanned component of defense. Syrsky clarified that this involves protecting rear cities, countering enemy assaults on the front line, and launching deep strike attacks on Russian territory. I'm closely monitoring the development of drone interceptor units. New crews are being formed, and drone hunters are in training. Our military needs as many of these high-tech UAVs as possible, he added. As a reminder, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that he had convened the meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The occupiers will have no peace there. We had a very detailed conversation about drones. We must significantly expand the use of all types of drones, especially those that help directly on the front line, Zelensky said.
Kremlin propaganda has openly spoken about the difficulties of the Russian armed forces in the Sumy direction. Even the most loyal mouthpieces of Moscow are now forced to look for excuses for new failures. The truth, which is inconvenient for Russians, was unexpectedly aired on the propaganda channel Solovyev Live. Z-blogger Aleksandr Arutyunov, known under the pseudonym Razvedos and part of the pro-Kremlin media pool, sadly stated that everything is bad with the offensive in the Sumy region. News from the field is that we have either slowed down our advance very seriously or it has been stopped by the enemy, the propagandist said. He also noted that the Russian side does not have a clear understanding of its own tasks in this section of the front. To objectively assess this news, we must be aware of our goals in the Sumy region, but we are not aware. All we know is the buffer zone, said Arutyunov. In fact, he admitted that even within the Russian propaganda machine, there is no clarity as to why this operation was launched at all. At the same time, he acknowledged that the Ukrainian side is sending in reinforcements and is successfully defending itself. There is no information about a certain exhaustion in the ranks of our units. Yes, our advance has really slowed down. Perhaps the enemy has found weak spots and our command has decided that it is time to stop, he added. Despite all attempts to smooth over reality, the facts speak for themselves. Russian troops managed to advance only 3 to 12 kilometers in depth, which, by military standards, is an extremely modest result, especially considering the large-scale losses of personnel and equipment. Numerous independent analysts agree. The attempt to break through in the Sumy direction weakens the Russian army, forcing it to stretch its forces and open vulnerable areas in other directions. Such a spread of the front does not bring strategic advantages, but only creates an additional burden on the resources and logistics of the occupiers. Of course, Arutyunov does not directly criticize the Kremlin strategy, but his cautious formulations and admission of a lack of understanding of the operation's goals speak for themselves. Even dedicated propagandists today can no longer hide the obvious. The offensive in Sumy Oblast has failed, and the Russian army is once again bogged down in Ukrainian defense.